It was the 55th day since Patrick had vanished from my life, 55 days since my fiancé of 8 years had blocked me without a word. 55 days since I had called off the wedding I'd been dreaming of for nearly a decade. While I was left behind, struggling with reporters swarming around my life, Patrick was at a secluded Buddhist temple with another woman, a girl named Rebecca who suffered from depression. He had locked himself away from the world, supposedly helping her heal. The temple, which had always been filled with the scent of incense, had been closed to the public for 6 months, all for Rebecca. Meanwhile, I was left homeless. The house we were supposed to share was no longer mine. The future we were supposed to build was reduced to ashes. Desperation pushed me to go to the temple to confront him, but the man who had once promised me forever coldly sent me back down the mountain, claiming he needed to preserve the sanctity of the temple. It was the dead of winter, and the bitter cold gnawed at my skin as I made my way down the treacherous path. My body gave out before I could reach the foot of the mountain. The last thing I remembered was the bone-chilling frost biting into my fingers as I collapsed into the snow. When I woke up in the hospital, I learned that Patrick had spent the past 6 months transforming the peaceful grounds of the temple into a rose garden for Rebecca. The roses, a universal symbol of love, mocked everything we once had. Those very flowers now filled the room that was supposed to be our wedding chamber. 6 months later, Patrick finally descended from his mountaintop sanctuary. He brought Rebecca back to the city as if she were a queen returning from exile. They made headlines together. Paparazzi captured every detail of their descent, from Patrick's custom-tailored suit to the temple's infamous Buddhist beads dangling from his wrist. As for me, I was just a joke now, a woman left behind for the sake of another. It was a week later when our paths crossed again. I was standing in a jewelry store, trying to pick out a wedding ring. Not for Patrick. Not anymore. This time, the groom was someone else. Someone who actually cared about me. The sales assistant's voice buzzed in the background as she praised the ring I had chosen, but I barely heard her. My eyes were locked on Patrick. He was here, in the same store, as if fate were playing a cruel trick. He looked different, yet the same. The same sharp jawline, the same commanding presence, but his eyes were colder now, detached, as though I had never meant anything to him. His gaze fell on the ring in my hand. A flicker of something crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a casual smile. He walked over, his footsteps steady and deliberate. "Why are you here alone?" he asked, his voice laced with feigned innocence. "I thought I was the one giving you a surprise." I noticed the bag in his hand before I could respond. It was from a high-end boutique, and I didn't need to guess what was inside. A diamond necklace. Not for me. It was for Rebecca. I had overheard her just yesterday, whining about wanting a diamond necklace for her birthday. And here he was, fulfilling her wish without hesitation. For Rebecca, Patrick would move mountains. For me, he couldn't even give me a wedding date after 8 years. A wave of bitterness surged through me, but I swallowed it down. I wouldn't let him see me hurt. Not anymore. I slipped the ring off my finger and handed it back to the sales assistant. "I've changed my mind," I said firmly. "I won't be buying this." Patrick frowned, clearly displeased. "Go ahead and buy it," he said absently, his attention drifting to his phone. "I've got time this afternoon. Let's go register our marriage." I froze, caught off guard by his audacity. Register our marriage? Now? After everything he'd done? For a moment, I just stared at him, my mind replaying the countless times I had compromised for him, bent over backward to make him happy. And now he wanted to act as if the past 6 months had never happened. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "I don't need this kind of relationship anymore," I said quietly. Then I walked out of the store, leaving him standing there, dumbfounded. Patrick followed me out, his footsteps echoing behind me. "Are you angry because of Rebecca again?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I've told you, our wedding is still on. I'm just looking after her for her father." His words hit me like a slap. This excuse again. Rebecca, the daughter of his late friend, who called him little uncle with eyes full of adoration. I turned to face him, my voice icy. Patrick, I understand. What I didn't say was that I understood all too well. I understood that I was just a placeholder in his life, a convenient shield to protect Rebecca from rumors. Our wedding might still be on in his mind, but in reality, the groom wasn't him anymore. Patrick didn't like my tone. He scowled, his voice rising. I don't have time for your emotions. If you don't want to get married, then fine. Cancel the wedding. I smiled bitterly. It's already cancelled, I said under my breath. He didn't hear me. Or maybe he just didn't care. As he walked away, I opened my phone and stared at the red exclamation mark next to his name in my chat list. He hadn't even unblocked me. How could he talk about marriage when he couldn't even face me? This was it. I was done lying to myself. Patrick's heart had never been with me, and it never would be. The red exclamation mark next to Patrick's name was a stark reminder of how far we had fallen apart. It was almost funny, really. 8 years of love, promises, and dreams, reduced to a single mark of rejection. If this had been before, maybe even a year ago, I might have chased after him. I might have begged him to unblock me, to let me back into his life. I would have convinced myself that he still cared, that I just needed to try harder. But not anymore. I closed the chat window and hailed a taxi. As the car weaved through the city streets, my phone buzzed. It was Leonardo, the man who was now my fiancé. His voice was warm, steady, and familiar. Hey, Carolina. Are you free? There's a new cafe that just opened. I'd like to take you there. I smiled faintly, his kindness washing over me like a balm for my wounded heart. Sure, I said. I'll meet you there. When I arrived at the cafe, Leonardo was already waiting. He stood as I approached, his dark hair catching the sunlight, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly. His presence was calming, a stark contrast to Patrick's volatile energy. Leonardo's eyes fell to my empty hands. Didn't you buy a ring? He asked, his brow furrowing slightly. I shook my head, forcing a smile. There wasn't anything that felt right. He didn't press further. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I've been meaning to give you this, he said, his voice tinged with nervousness. I brought it back from France. I wasn't sure if you'd like it, so I hesitated. My breath caught as I opened the box. Inside was a delicate ring with a rare pink diamond. The band was engraved with my name, a personal touch that made my chest tighten with emotion. It's beautiful, I whispered, my voice shaky. Leonardo's expression softened. I wanted it to be something special, just for you. Tears pricked my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly valued. I started to slip the ring onto my finger when my phone buzzed again. Patrick. His name flashing on the screen felt like a slap in the face. I hesitated, torn between ignoring the call and answering it. Leonardo noticed my hesitation. You don't have to answer that, he said gently, his hand brushing against mine. But I couldn't help myself. Part of me needed to hear what Patrick had to say. I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello? Where are you? Patrick's voice was impatient, as if he had a right to know. I've sent the driver to pick you up. Let's go register our marriage. I nearly laughed out loud. Was he serious? After months of ignoring me, after abandoning me for Rebecca, he thought he could just snap his fingers and I'd come running back. Patrick, I said, my voice steady, I'm not registering anything with you. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low, angry scoff. What are you talking about? We've been planning this for years. Stop being childish. Childish. That word hit a nerve. For years, Patrick had dismissed my feelings, calling them childish, irrational, or overly emotional. I took a deep breath, glancing at Leonardo, who was watching me with quiet concern. "Patrick, we're done. You just don't realize it yet." I hung up before he could respond and set the phone down on the table. My hands trembled slightly, but I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. Leonardo reached across the table and took my hand in his. "Are you okay?" I nodded, my smile shaky but genuine. "I will be." Later that evening, Patrick's car pulled up in front of my apartment. I had just stepped outside when his driver stopped me. "Miss Carolina, Mr. Patrick is here to see you," the driver said, opening the car door. Patrick was sitting in the back seat, his expression unreadable. He rolled down the window, his gaze immediately landing on the bag in my hand. "What's that?" he asked, his tone sharp. I instinctively hid the ring box behind my back, not wanting him to see it. "Nothing," I said quickly, stepping away from the car. Patrick's eyes narrowed. "I saw you holding something. Was it a ring?" "You saw wrong," I replied, my voice calm but firm. Before he could question me further, his phone buzzed. The sound of Rebecca's panicked voice came through the speaker. "Little uncle. I think someone's following me." Patrick's entire demeanor shifted. He stiffened, his jaw clenching as he gripped the phone tightly. "Rebecca, don't move. I'm coming to get you." He didn't even look at me as he ordered the driver to take him to Rebecca's location. I watched him go, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Rebecca was waiting on a quiet roadside when Patrick arrived. She was sitting on the curb, looking small and vulnerable. But the moment she saw him, her eyes lit up. "Little uncle," she cried, running into his arms. Patrick held her tightly, whispering reassurances as she clung to him. From the shadows, I watched the scene unfold, my heart growing colder with each passing second. Rebecca's tears seemed fake, her sobs overly dramatic. I couldn't help but think she had orchestrated this whole thing to keep Patrick under her thumb. And Patrick, ever the protector, fell for it every time. As Patrick carried Rebecca to the car, he turned back toward me, hesitating for a brief moment. "You can get home on your own," he said, his tone dismissive. I stared at him, stunned. We were in the middle of nowhere, and he expected me to figure it out by myself. I didn't even bother responding. I turned on my heel and pulled out my phone, calling Leonardo. When he picked me up, he didn't ask questions. He just drove me home, his presence steady and reassuring. That night, Patrick returned home to find me packing my belongings. He stood in the doorway, his face pale and tense. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't look at him as I folded another shirt into my suitcase. "I'm moving out," I said simply. Patrick's jaw tightened. "You can't just leave. We're getting married." I finally turned to face him, meeting his gaze head-on. "No, Patrick. We're not. The wedding was cancelled 6 months ago. You just didn't notice." The shock on his face would have been satisfying if it hadn't come so late. I grabbed my suitcase and walked past him, my heart pounding. For the first time in 8 years, I was taking control of my life. And it felt good. Patrick's reaction to my decision to leave was etched into my memory, shock, anger, and disbelief, all mingling together. For a man so accustomed to being in control, my defiance was a bitter pill to swallow. But as I stepped out of that house, dragging my suitcase behind me, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I had finally broken free from the chains of his indifference. I stayed at Anna's house for the next few days, trying to adjust to my newfound freedom. Anna, my best friend and fiercest ally, welcomed me with open arms. Her small beauty salon was where I found solace, far away from the chaos of my past. "You did the right thing, Caro," Anna said one morning as we sat together, sipping coffee. "That man didn't deserve you." I nodded, but her words didn't erase the ache in my chest. 8 years of my life had been intertwined with Patrick's. Letting go wasn't as easy as walking out the door. A few days later, Patrick showed up at Anna's salon. I was in the middle of helping Anna organize some supplies when I heard the unmistakable sound of his voice. "Where is she?" Patrick demanded, his tone cold and commanding. Anna stepped out from behind the counter, her arms crossed. "What are you doing here, Patrick?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I'm here to see Carolina," he replied, his eyes scanning the room. When his gaze landed on me, his expression hardened. "We need to talk." I sighed, setting down the box I was holding. "There's nothing left to say, Patrick." But he wasn't willing to let it go. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low but filled with frustration. "We've been together for 8 years, Carolina. You can't just throw that away." I laughed bitterly. "I'm not the one who threw it away, Patrick. You did. Every time you put Rebecca before me, every time you dismissed my feelings, you threw it away." He opened his mouth to respond, but Anna cut him off. "All right, that's enough," she said, stepping between us. "If you're here to guilt her into going back to you, save your breath. Carolina doesn't need you anymore." Patrick glared at her, his jaw tightening. "This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Anna shot back. "I'm her friend, and I'm not going to stand by while you manipulate her." "Stop," I said, my voice firm. "Both of you, stop." I turned to Patrick, meeting his gaze. "Patrick, whatever we had is over. I'm moving on, and I suggest you do the same." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, but then his shoulders slumped. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the salon. Later that evening, I received a call from Leonardo. "I heard Patrick showed up at Anna's salon," he said, his voice calm but tinged with concern. "News travels fast," I said with a small laugh. "I'm worried about you, Caro," he admitted. "Patrick doesn't seem like the type to let things go easily." I appreciated his concern, but I didn't want him to worry. "I can handle Patrick," I assured him. Still, his words lingered in my mind long after our conversation ended. The next morning, Patrick's driver showed up at Anna's house with a message. "Miss Carolina," the driver said, his tone formal. "Mr. Patrick has asked me to deliver this to you." He handed me a small envelope before walking back to the car. I stared at the envelope for a long moment, debating whether or not to open it. Curiosity eventually won out, and I tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter from Patrick. "Carolina, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. But you can't just erase 8 years. You can't erase everything we've been through together. I'll wait for you, Carolina. I'll wait as long as it takes." I folded the letter and set it aside, my emotions swirling. His words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to pull me back into his orbit. But I wasn't the same woman who had spent years waiting for him to choose me. As the days passed, I focused on finalizing the details of my wedding with Leonardo. The invitations had been sent out, the venue was booked, and my dress was ready. One morning, as I was preparing to leave for a dress fitting, Patrick showed up again. This time, he was waiting outside Anna's house, leaning against his car. "Carolina," he said as I approached. "We need to talk." I sighed, my patience wearing thin. "Patrick, I don't have time for this." "Just 5 minutes," he pleaded. "That's all I'm asking for." Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Fine. 5 minutes." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I've let you down. But I still love you, Carolina. I can't imagine my life without you." I shook my head, my heart aching. "If you loved me, Patrick, you wouldn't have treated me the way you did. Love isn't just words. It's actions. And your actions have shown me where I stand in your life." His expression twisted with frustration. "Rebecca, stop," I said, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear her name anymore. This isn't about her. This is about us. Or rather, the lack of us. Patrick looked like he wanted to argue, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone. That evening, I met Leonardo at the wedding venue for a final walkthrough. He greeted me with a warm smile, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of my emotions. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his hand brushing against mine. I smiled, the weight of the day melting away under his touch. "Better now," I admitted. As we walked through the venue, discussing the final details, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. With Leonardo, there were no mind games, no manipulation, no constant battles for attention. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The days leading up to my wedding with Leonardo were a whirlwind of final preparations. Every detail, from the floral arrangements to the seating chart, demanded my attention. But despite the chaos, there was an unmistakable sense of calm in my heart, a calm that came from knowing I was finally stepping into a future free of Patrick's shadow. Leonardo was my rock throughout it all. His steady presence and unwavering support were like a balm for my weary soul. With him, there were no pretenses, no games. He saw me for who I was and accepted me, flaws and all. But Patrick wasn't ready to let me go. On the morning of my wedding rehearsal, Anna called me in a panic. "Caro, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice frantic. "Patrick's here." I froze, gripping the phone tightly. "What do you mean he's there?" "At the venue?" "Yes." "He showed up with Rebecca, of all people. He's making a scene and demanding to see you." My heart sank. The last thing I wanted was for Patrick to disrupt what was supposed to be a happy day. "I'm on my way," I said, hanging up and grabbing my keys. When I arrived at the venue, Patrick was standing in the middle of the room, his presence commanding as always. Rebecca was clinging to his arm, her expression smug and triumphant. The sight of them together ignited a fire in me. I had spent years watching Rebecca insert herself into my life, years tolerating her presence, because Patrick had insisted she was family. But this time I wouldn't let her win. "Patrick," I said, my voice cold and steady as I approached. "What are you doing here?" He turned to face me, his expression softening as his eyes met mine. "I needed to see you," he said. "We need to talk." "There's nothing left to talk about," I replied firmly. "You shouldn't be here." Rebecca tightened her grip on his arm, her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, don't be so harsh, Carolina. Patrick just wants to make sure you're happy. Isn't that sweet of him?" Her condescension was like nails on a chalkboard. I clenched my fists, refusing to let her get under my skin. "This isn't about you, Rebecca," I said, my gaze locked on Patrick. "Why are you really here?" Patrick hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I can't let you go through with this," he said finally. "I made a mistake, Carolina. I see that now. I should have fought for us, but instead, I let you slip away." I laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tension in the room. "You didn't let me slip away, Patrick. You pushed me away. Over and over again." Rebecca's smirk faltered, and she looked up at Patrick, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Little uncle, you're not really saying you regret taking care of me, are you?" Patrick's gaze flickered to her, and for a moment, I thought he might defend her. But then he surprised me. "Rebecca," he said quietly, his tone firm. "This has nothing to do with you. Wait in the car." Her jaw dropped, her eyes filling with disbelief. "But, go," Patrick said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn between obeying him and standing her ground. But eventually, she huffed and stormed out of the room, leaving us alone. Patrick turned back to me, his expression pained. "Carolina, I know I've hurt you. I know I've let you down in ways I can never undo. But I can't stand the thought of you marrying someone else." I crossed my arms, my resolve unshaken. "You don't have a say in my life anymore, Patrick. You lost that right when you chose Rebecca over me. I didn't choose her, he said, his voice desperate. I was trying to keep a promise to her father. That's all. I never loved her the way I love you. His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. But they didn't have the power they once did. Love isn't just words, Patrick, I said softly. It's actions. And your actions have shown me exactly where I stand in your life. He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself to you. Just give me another chance. I shook my head, my heart breaking for the man he could have been. It's too late, Patrick. I've moved on. The rehearsal continued without further interruptions, but Patrick's appearance lingered in my mind. As I walked through the motions of practicing for the ceremony, I couldn't shake the memory of his words, his desperation. That evening, Leonardo came over to check on me. You've been quiet, he said as we sat together on the couch. Did something happen today? I hesitated, debating whether or not to tell him about Patrick's visit. But I decided to be honest. Patrick came to the venue, I admitted. He tried to convince me to call off the wedding. Leonardo's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. Did he threaten you? No, I said quickly. It wasn't like that. He said he made a mistake and wanted another chance. Leonardo was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached over and took my hand, his touch warm and steady. You don't have to worry about him, Carolina, he said firmly. I'll make sure he doesn't bother you again. I smiled faintly, grateful for his support. Thank you, Leonardo. For everything. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. As I stood in front of the mirror, dressed in my wedding gown, I couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. This was it, the start of a new chapter in my life. Anna bustled around me, fussing over every detail. You look stunning, Caro, she said, her voice brimming with pride. I smiled, my reflection staring back at me with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. Thank you, Anna. For everything. She waved me off, her eyes shining with emotion. Don't make me cry. It'll ruin my makeup. The ceremony began without a hitch. The venue was filled with friends and family, all there to celebrate our union. As I walked down the aisle, my eyes met Leonardo's, and everything else faded away. He smiled at me, his gaze filled with warmth and love. In that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. But just as the officiant began to speak, the doors to the venue burst open. Patrick stood in the doorway, his face pale and determined. Stop, he said, his voice echoing through the room. I can't let this happen. Gasps rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to him. My heart sank, and I felt Leonardo's hand tighten around mine. Patrick, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. You don't belong here. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto mine. Please, Carolina. Don't do this. Don't marry him. The entire room froze as Patrick's voice echoed through the venue. Every guest turned toward him, their expressions a mix of confusion and shock. The officiant stopped mid-sentence, looking to me for guidance. Leonardo's grip on my hand tightened, a silent reassurance that he was there, steady as always. But my heart was pounding, and my mind raced. Patrick had crossed a line, and this time I wouldn't let him control the narrative. Patrick, I said, my voice calm but firm. You don't belong here. Leave. He took another step forward, ignoring my words. Carolina, please. Just listen to me. I made a mistake, several mistakes. But I can't let you do this. I can't lose you. Leonardo's jaw clenched, and I could feel the tension radiating from him. But he didn't interrupt, allowing me to handle this. I straightened my shoulders, meeting Patrick's desperate gaze with an unwavering calm. You lost me a long time ago, Patrick. This isn't your moment. It's mine. Carolina, you can't mean that, he said, his voice breaking. We've been through so much together. You can't just erase 8 years. You're right, I said, my voice soft but resolute. I can't erase those years. But I can choose to move forward. And I have. Patrick's eyes flicked to Leonardo, and his expression darkened. With him, he spat, the venom in his voice cutting through the air. You've only known him for 6 months. How can you trust him? How can you throw away everything we had for a man you barely know? Leonardo finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Because I treat her the way she deserves to be treated, he said, his tone steady and unwavering. With respect. With love. 2 things you've never truly given her. Patrick glared at him, his hands curling into fists. You don't understand what we've been through, what we had. You can't replace me. Leonardo didn't flinch. I don't need to replace you. Carolina has already chosen me. The tension in the room was palpable. Guests whispered among themselves, their curiosity and confusion growing with every passing second. I felt my cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from anger. Patrick had no right to do this, to ruin what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Patrick, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. Enough. This isn't about you. This is about me. And I'm done letting you control my life. His face fell, the weight of my words finally hitting him. Carolina, please, he said, his voice cracking. I love you. No, Patrick, I said, shaking my head. You love the idea of me. You love having me as a safety net, someone who will always be there no matter how many times you put Rebecca first. But that's not love. That's convenience. Patrick looked as though I had slapped him. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. Love isn't about making someone feel small, I continued, my voice steady, despite the storm raging in my chest. It's not about using someone to protect your image or to shield someone else from judgment. Love is about partnership, about mutual respect. And you've never given me that. Tears welled up in his eyes, but I didn't feel pity. I felt free. Patrick took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Carolina, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know how to fix this. You can't, I said simply. Because I've already moved on. I'm marrying Leonardo, and nothing you say or do will change that. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me as if trying to process my words. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the venue. The doors closed behind him, and the room was silent. Leonardo turned to me, his eyes searching mine. Are you okay? He asked softly. I nodded, though my heart was still racing. I'm fine, I said, squeezing his hand. Let's continue. The ceremony resumed, and this time, there were no interruptions. As Leonardo slipped the ring onto my finger, a sense of peace washed over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. When it was my turn, I slid the ring onto Leonardo's finger, my hand steady. I do, I said, my voice strong and sure. The officiant smiled. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Leonardo leaned in, his hands gently cupping my face as he pressed his lips to mine. The room erupted into cheers and applause, but all I could focus on was the man in front of me, the man who had shown me what love truly meant. That evening, as we sat together in our new home, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led me to this moment. Patrick's final plea, Rebecca's manipulations, and my own journey of self-discovery had all brought me here. Leonardo handed me a cup of tea, his gaze soft. What are you thinking about? He asked. Just, how grateful I am, I said, my voice filled with emotion. He smiled, reaching for my hand. I'm grateful too. For you. For us. I leaned into him, letting his warmth envelop me. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe. I felt loved. Meanwhile, Patrick was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. The public fallout from his relationship with Rebecca had already begun, and rumors swirled about the true nature of their connection. Rebecca, ever the opportunist, had wasted no time stirring the pot. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that Patrick had used her, only to discard her when it became inconvenient. The media devoured the drama, turning Patrick into a villain overnight. The days after the wedding were blissfully calm. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. No longer was my life dominated by Patrick's manipulation or Rebecca's schemes. Instead, I was surrounded by love, stability, and the promise of a brighter future with Leonardo. But Patrick's story didn't end the day he walked out of my wedding. Rebecca had taken Patrick's defeat personally, and she made sure the world knew about it. Social media exploded with videos, photos, and whispers of the chaos that had surrounded us. Rebecca, ever the actress, painted herself as the tragic victim of unrequited love, and Patrick as the cold-hearted uncle who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. Her dramatic accusations spread like wildfire, and soon, Patrick became the focus of public scrutiny. Every aspect of his life was picked apart by the media, from his mysterious 6-month retreat at the temple to his tangled relationships with me and Rebecca. One video in particular went viral, a clip of Patrick leaving the temple with Rebecca, the infamous Buddhist beads on his wrist clearly visible. People speculated about everything, his intentions, his moral character, even his mental state. The same internet that had once praised him as a compassionate, selfless man now turned on him with savage ferocity. He became a punchline, a cautionary tale of arrogance and poor judgment. Meanwhile, Rebecca wasn't done with her theatrics. Even after Patrick distanced himself from her, sending her abroad to live with relatives, she continued to stir up trouble. She made cryptic posts online, hinting at dark secrets about Patrick and their time together. She even claimed that she had been mistreated by him, though anyone who knew Patrick well enough could see through her lies. Leonardo, ever the strategist, took swift action. He quietly reached out to the authorities, sharing evidence of Rebecca's reckless behavior, including her history of using illegal substances. It wasn't long before Rebecca's facade crumbled. She was arrested and sent to a rehabilitation center, far away from the public eye. The once adored tragic girl had become a pariah, her lies exposed for all to see. As for Patrick, the damage was irreparable. His reputation was in tatters, and his business empire began to crumble. With no allies left to shield him, he was forced to resign from his company, retreating from the public eye entirely. One evening, weeks after the wedding, I received a letter from Patrick. The envelope was simple, unassuming, with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, covered in his familiar handwriting. Carolina, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this. But I need to say it. I was wrong. About everything. I was wrong to take you for granted, to put Rebecca before you, to think that you would always wait for me. I see that now, and I hate myself for it. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I ruined it. I ruined us. I hope you find the happiness I couldn't give you. You deserve it more than anyone I've ever known. Goodbye, Patrick. I stared at the letter for a long time, my emotions swirling. There was a time when I would have given anything to hear those words from him. But now, they felt hollow, too little too late. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, a relic of a chapter one had finally closed. Life with Leonardo was everything I had ever dreamed of and more. He wasn't just my husband, he was my partner, my confidant, my safe haven. Together, we built a life filled with love, laughter, and mutual respect. One afternoon, as we were sitting in the garden of our home, Leonardo reached over and took my hand. I have something to tell you, he said, his voice filled with excitement. What is it? I asked, smiling at his boyish enthusiasm. He pulled out a small envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a sonogram, a tiny glimpse of the new life we had created together. We're going to be parents, he said, his eyes shining with joy. Tears filled my eyes as I stared at the image. This was our new beginning, our fresh start. I looked at Leonardo, my heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" he asked, tilting his head. "For everything," I said. "For showing me what love really means. For giving me a second chance at happiness." He smiled, pulling me into his arms. "You deserve it, Carolina. You always have." As I leaned against him, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, I realized just how far I had come. Patrick was a part of my past, a chapter that had shaped me but no longer defined me. With Leonardo by my side and a future full of promise ahead, I finally felt at peace. The roses Patrick had once planted for Rebecca at the temple were long forgotten. But in my own garden, Leonardo and I had planted something far more enduring: hope, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And that, I realized, was all I had ever wanted.